We are live again for our 9th installment of the Think Fitness Life podcast with your host, myself, Matthew Gluckman. And we have Eric Menchie over in Boston. And now we picked up a third co-host with Mike Urso, also in Boston. Today we're going to talk about macronutrients and micronutrients. We have a couple announcements to start us off. So real quick, next week we will be going into the deadlift. So if anyone has any questions or would like to hear any certain information about the deadlift, please write us an email. We'll answer your questions live recorded on the air. It's thinkfitnesslife, all one word, at gmail.com. And let's go into the announcements. So I want to start off and talk about this guy, Paul Stamets. And he is the creator of Host Defense mushrooms. And the idea is these fungi have so many unique benefits in our body, in our mind, in our brain, that is just non-comparable to some of the other already approved, quotes, air quotes on that one, medications that are in the pharmaceutical industry. So I highly, highly recommend going to Joe Rogan's podcast and looking up Paul Stamets. It's 2 hours, but it is the most enjoyable 2 hours you'll ever listen to. So check that out. And Urso, what do you got for us?
Yeah, I mean, just to touch on that too, there was some fascinating stuff about those mushrooms that I learned, not just from that podcast, but just, diving deeper in the internet. And lion's mane being one of them. I think the technical term, if you look it up on examine.com, is Yamabushitaki. And it's essentially, it's hard to find in the U.S., I believe. I think they find it in the old growth forest in Washington State. But essentially,
Yep.
There's been a lot of research on it. And right now they're researching it as a preventative and even a reversing measure for Alzheimer's, which I thought was really fascinating. And basically, it's a mushroom that stimulates neurogenesis. So it's regenerating kind of like the myelin on the axis of the nerves in the brain. I mean, just really fascinating stuff. And it's the only mushroom species, I suppose, that what I've learned, that they've been able to actually, create neurogenesis of the brain. I know Joe Rogan uses some, mushroom supplements like Cordyceps, I think is in their On It brand stuff. I want to say the Alpha Brain supplement they make. But this lion's mane is really fascinating to see kind of, where they're going with this, and the fact that, the drug companies have no interest in it because they can't patent it, essentially. So
Yeah, exactly. It really is fascinating. They talk about this mouse study they did, and they had them learn where the food was in a maze, and then they injected them with a serum that would basically mimic Alzheimer's and start to break down their myelin sheath. And over a period of time, these mice got so confused in the maze and they weren't able to figure out where the food was. And they then did a lion's mane serum, and a few weeks later, the majority of these mice had been able to remember and reestablish those connections to find the food again. And then obviously, that's why they do studies with mice in the initial, because then they do sacrifice the mice and examine the brain, and they had shown that, like you had said, the myelin sheath itself was actually regenerating. And we know that right now the first line of treatment for Alzheimer's is L-DOPA, because it's a precursor to help kind of lube the myelin sheath. But the problem is you have to continuously up the dosage because your body creates a threshold or resistance to it. So it's just kind of back to politics of Western medicine philosophy of, if you have a rock in your shoe, take some Advil versus try to find the rock and get it out of the shoe. So I just think it's so fascinating to have somebody really investigating the oldest living organism, fungi, in one of the oldest forests in the world in Washington. And it's proven to help in so many different ways, especially cognitively. So yeah, I just want people to check that out and hear about it. hostdefense.com. His name's Paul Stamets. But yeah.
And I think that's the new way a lot of these aids are going, is the more cognitive aspect of it, rather than performance and all that stuff. But preserving the neural function is huge. And I know Mike's got an article about creatine that he'll dive into in a sec about not only benefit of building muscle, but the cognitive. And I'll let you take that one, Mike.
Yeah, hell of a segue, man, I have to say. um, but yeah,
You
essentially there
nerds.
was there was a study, and they went into a little bit more depth in an article in the Strength and Conditioning Journal, where they expanded on some of the research that's been, you know, going out on creatine not just being in the past. It's essentially been researched in regards to its performance enhancement, abilities. More recently, they're looking at it as now a cognitive enhancement type of supplement, and it's really fascinating to see what some of these studies are now showing, where it's actually helping some people with mild depression. It's helping increase decision making and cognitive function. And it kind of makes sense when you start to think about what it does from a kind of cellular level with ATP. And it's just really fascinating to think, something like this, it's extremely cheap to buy. There's little to no side effects or downside to taking this. It's one of the most well-researched sports supplements, I would say, in the last, several decades. And just really fascinating to see some new research coming out, because just gaining a cognitive advantage, has to have a huge impact on your performance, as well as just, the performance enhancements that you're getting from the creatine.
Now, most, and I should say by most, like 99% of pre-workout supplements or, those little sports drinks, they have a little bit of creatine in it. Is that going to be enough? Or do you recommend maybe getting just an isolate of just creatine?
I mean, there's been a lot of different forms, I feel like, that have come out. There was an ethyl ester that came out, but creatine monohydrate was, the original form that I think most people were using way back in the day. I would say, like, even when I was in high school, it was in the high school locker room, back in like the mid 1990s to late 1990s. And so creatine monohydrate is kind of come back and being the more predominant version that I'm seeing in most of the pre-workout supplements, because it's kind of tried and true. I think your body just absorbs it, for whatever reason. 5 milligrams seems to be, or sorry, 5 grams of a daily dose seems to kind of be the standard across the board when you listen to what all the experts are saying.
But would you recommend getting it in isolated form? Or would you say that if you're already getting pre-workouts, if you already are doing that type of supplementation, that you're getting enough creatine monohydrate already?
I mean, that's a good question. I don't know, and simply because I don't know. It's similar to taking like several medications at the same time. You don't really know how they're all going to interact with one another, and if one's going to cancel the other out.
Right.
So I would almost say you would want to isolate it in your supplement regimen if you were doing a self experiment to see if it was the thing that was going to move the needle on improved strength and cognitive function and all those other attributes that you were looking to gain.
And how long would you say that somebody would need to kind of put themselves through a test trial to really give it a fair chance?
Yeah, I mean, another good question. I would say, the couple things that I've heard of most recently is that you don't need to do a loading phase anymore. Meaning, a lot of people were doing like 20 grams a day for the first five
Right. Like a
days.
cumulative effect.
Yeah, and like getting it into your system. What I'm learning now is that may not necessarily be the case, and may not actually give you the type of benefits. Just a 5 gram daily dose, probably all that's
Yeah,
necessary.
especially for people who just want a cognitive effect. I wouldn't recommend them going for, these crazy pre-workouts or matrices or, complex supplements. I would say get a pure unflavored creatine monohydrate powder form, and, mix it with water, mix it with whatever you drink in the morning. I had some clients, take it with juice in the morning. I was like, perfect, that's fine, but I feel like you don't need to have all the extra stuff with the pre-workouts. And with these proprietary blends, you don't know actually how much creatine you're actually going to get. So I always tell people on that side, just be careful of how much you think you're getting compared to what you could actually know. So I'd agree with you on that one, Mike.
Yeah, I agree with kind of less is more, because a lot of these supplement companies are just so convoluted with garbage in the pre-workout supplements. And ultimately they just want you to sell you a product that tastes good and that you feel. So they're just going to load up a bunch of caffeine and load up on the artificial sweeteners so they can write sugar free on the front. And I don't know, I'm just not a big fan of the supplement industry as a whole, just because they should be about helping people gain health improvements, and it just seems like they try to pull the wool over people's eyes. So yeah, I like the idea of just like trying it, like in any experiment. You control all the variables and you change one, you see and observe. But I think it's really fascinating to find these things and hear these things and see these studies about things that are enhancing and improving their brain function. Because up until this point, I feel like a lot of the information and references out there is just talking about how to be proactive, but there's really not a lot out there for people who may have already started to be diagnosed with like Alzheimer's or neurodegenerative disease. And in those cases, these mushrooms, this creatine, all play a role in actually being able to reverse those negative results from
Which
the
is great.
Alzheimer's.
Yeah, I think, yeah, when you look at like, there are so many things out there now that we're seeing that can preserve cognitive function, but the fact that we're now, you know, finding things that can actually expand cognitive function, that's a game changer. You know what I mean? That's a huge game changer. And you have to kind of look into nutrition and say, well, nutrition and poor nutrition dietary habits are usually the predominant reason why cognitive decline happens, as well as lack of exercise and all these other things. But the ability for us to be able to possibly expand cognitive function with some of these supplements, pretty fascinating stuff going on right now.
Totally. And if you add it up,
Yeah.
I tell a lot of people, you could take the supplements, but also, make sure we're getting exercise in daily and keep that brain healthy and fresh.
I'm glad you said that, because one thing I was going to say, the last thing I was going to say about this topic was um, certain ways that you exercise can actually increase the BDNF in your brain, the brain derived neurotrophic factor. So doing like intervals, just like all out fast paced work for 5 to 10 seconds, and then resting, like doing that type of spiking your heart rate and maximum effort and letting it come back down and bringing it back up, doing that type of exercise actually increases, basically it increases the strength of your brain and its neurotransmitters and the way that its pathways operate. So it's pretty fascinating. If you wanted to, you could literally create a nutrition plan and a workout program specifically geared towards cognitive
Yeah.
improvements.
And that's where the creatine helps when, you get those short bursts. The ATP turnover is great.
Great.
Combine the supplements. But on the other side, speaking of kind of supplements and what they want, let's get back to real food and like the macronutrients, the micronutrients of what people actually really need.
We're gonna call you the Segway because you're just so good at it. But
For
yeah,
real,
let's get
wow.
into it. Let's get into the open discussion. We're going to talk about macronutrients first, and then dive into micronutrients. Yeah, I mean, protein, carbs, and fats. Tell me more, Menchie.
My favorite? Oof. Probably protein. The muscle builder. I've been working out since what, high school? So protein's got to be my number one.
Protein
Yeah,
and bicep curls.
That's how we
for
do it.
Menchie.
All important across the board. I tell a lot of people, you got to have these macronutrients from full food and good food sources rather than try to get them from supplements. And I think nowadays a lot of people are trying to go the supplement route and get all these things in, and you don't know the quality of these supplements or where they come from, how they're being made. So first off the bat, I tell people, make sure you ditch that stuff first and look at whole foods, healthy foods. And let's start with proteins first. I say, let's dive into that.
Yeah, I think one thing though too, the reason why whole foods are a lot better too is because kind of the longer it takes your digestive system to kind of absorb the nutrients from it. Also, the bioavailability of a lot of the foods we eat is going to be a lot greater than, say, an isolated supplement that you don't even know where that sourcing of whatever it is came from. Like it could be basically like it could be like omega-3s from something that you're actually could be allergic to. So just
Yeah.
try to get all your nutrients from real food for sure.
And to that bioavailability point, you actually use protein to make enzymes in your body, use it to make enzymes, protein. I mean, obviously it builds and repairs your tissues, but hair, nails, all those things are mostly made up of proteins. So, I mean, it is critical to get these kind of building blocks into your system. And I agree 100%. In whole food form, there is probably no better way to make sure that your body's actually uptaking what you're putting in it. I can honestly say I haven't had a protein shake in, gosh, I don't know, several years. I really,
Same.
for one,
Same.
I don't care for the taste of it. It's gross and chalky. It doesn't feel like it does me any good in giving me sustenance. And I just like how food tastes. I would much rather eat a nice piece of lean chicken or turkey or chow into a steak post workout than having to slug down a nasty gooey protein shake. But that's just me. But
No, I completely agree. And one reason I had to step away from protein was because of ulcerative colitis. And I met this brilliant doctor out of actually Medford, Massachusetts, and he was just blowing my mind about micronutrients and nanoparticles that are in a lot of these supplements. And first of all, whey does contain lactose. So if you're lactose intolerant, or if you have sensitive digestive issues or any inflammatory bowel disease, you're going to want to stay away from that because it's going to cause extra inflammation that you don't need. But the majority of these supplement companies put a nanoparticle named titanium dioxide in their supplement strictly just to make it look shinier and more appealing. And that has been shown that it has a toxic behavior in your brain. And in certain studies done with people who take supplements, even in multivitamins, sometimes has titanium dioxide.
isn't it in makeup?
Yes, it
I think
is.
I've heard it's in makeup too.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah, it's shiny.
Oh, interesting.
They haven't proven that it causes cancer or anything like that, but I look at things kind of on an ancestral way, and I can tell you that like my grandparents were not eating foods with titanium dioxide in it. None of our grandparents were. So it's just again back to how businesses work and how they kind of pull the wool over consumers' eyes. It's like, aren't you a nutrition company? Aren't you a supplement company? Aren't you supposed to be looking out for my health? Isn't that what your business does? It pisses me off, honestly.
Preach, brother,
Yeah,
preach.
before I get fired up over here.
But I think a lot of
move
times,
on.
and these protein supplement companies feed off of it, is they know people don't get enough protein. And I think we mentioned this on a couple podcasts ago about the protein intake of the older population, and they weren't getting enough. And kind of talking to young athletes recently, kind of noticing and seeing a trend that maybe they don't get enough too, depending on their growth and development, that they're more leaning towards these carb sources or fat sources and kind of taken back from good protein sources. And I think that's key to overall development, growth, and function. And like Mike said, we can go back to the cognitive, amino acids are essential for brain function and just mood and everything else. So it goes a long way. And I think a lot of people are missing out on that protein boat.
Yeah, similar to like carbohydrate needs, protein as well is very relevant to your activity levels. Obviously, higher activity levels and more rigorous and intense activity levels, you're going to need more in your diet and in your daily intake. So those are all things that people need to consider as well. I mean, you can. I don't know if you can poison yourself with protein, but if you were like sedentary and all you
You
ate was like the
can.
carnivore diet, for example, on a completely sedentary lifestyle, I would say that would have some really ill effects on your
If
physiology.
If you overdo your protein shakes, there are too many trace elements now in your body, and you have an overabundance of metals in your body. And usually, the first place they get stuck is the kidneys. And they actually have proven that you can overdo protein supplements. But that does get me back to kind of the bigger picture here is like protein, carbs, fats. There is no perfect one size fits all ratio because you're right. Everyone's activity levels are different. Everyone's body acts differently with these macronutrients in their system. But also, I think one big misstep in the fitness world is protein, 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 protein. Post workout, that 30 minutes, but when you finish your workout and then everyone always grabs a shake. No, I'm going for food. I'm going for rice. I'm going for carrots. I'm going for some type of carbohydrates. A low glycemic index carbohydrate, because your body's like a sponge. You just kind of used up a good portion of its glycogen. You want to get ready for the next workout. Your body's not going to absorb protein. In fact, it's going to repair the proteins, the muscle with proteins that you've kind of emulsified or digested from previous meals. So it's good to still get protein because you're going to continue that process in the future, but your body's searching for glycogen. It's searching for carbohydrates. And I think that's one huge misstep is everyone's searching for that protein shake. And I'm like, no, man, I'd rather you eat a banana or an apple or, have a couple scoops of peanut butter than a protein
totally.
shake.
And I think that's what kind of scares people away from the whole protein. And when you do evals and you ask people, how's your protein? And I see this a lot, and especially the female population is they say they're just not getting enough or not even thinking about a lot of protein. And you always tell them that the health benefits rather than just take muscle building off the table, maintaining blood pH, controlling fluid volume. I mean, even the thermogenic effect of protein on weight loss itself or the metabolic rate. And I know precision nutrition is big on protein as a macronutrient and its important role in the body and how you can kind of utilize that, like we talked about last week, to incorporate behavior change such as weight loss or whatever your goal is to derive that.
Yeah. Also, too, something we haven't mentioned is kind of the biological feedback response from protein as well. But protein is the most satiating macronutrient of the three. In meaning, if people
makes you fuller.
Yeah, if people have a tendency to overeat, or they eat, they feel like they eat too much or they eat too many carbs. If you eat a fair amount of protein with your meal, you're not going to be hungry and feel like you're going to overeat. Whereas carbohydrates, overeating a lot of carbohydrates will make you feel hungry. They will give you more cravings. Protein's not going to do that. Protein is going to keep you satiated. It's going to allow you to feel fuller for longer. And that can have an immense effect on that biological feedback response that your body's getting. So, mentally, that's going to affect you. You're not going to get those cravings that you may get otherwise.
Yeah, I'm always going to reference Joe Rogan on this podcast for anyone who's listening. Just FYI, I love the guy. He's brilliant. He always brings brilliant people on his show. Nina Techholz, Teicholz, was on one of the shows, one of the episodes, and she was promoting her book, talking about her book, The Big Fat Surprise. And in it, she goes in depth about sort of the politics and the money that goes into promoting in the nutrition world, and how we've always promoted this like carb heavy diet versus like and low fats, when in reality like we should be getting more fats and we should be eating like chicken thighs versus chicken breasts, etc. But she talks about it, and in her investigative work, she there was a study where they put a bunch of pork chops in front of people and they said eat, and everybody got full. And then they did the same thing with some sort of carbohydrate, and nobody got full. And the takeaway, this is purely anecdotal, but the takeaway was sort of, when we are consuming carbohydrates, we're never satiated, we're never full, and it's almost like the body is still searching for some type of nutritional value out of something, and that's what keeps you hungry. You continue to eat. But if you ate like just pork chops or chicken, you would definitely get to a point where you get full. And I know everybody can relate to that because you definitely have had those, everyone had those times where they had a box of crackers or a bag of chips and you're like, I'm just going to have just one at a time. You're just watching your shows and all of a sudden the bag's empty and you're still
And
hungry.
I think that's where a lot of people get in trouble
Dun,
is
dun.
since maybe their protein intake is a little bit lower, that they tend to have a higher intake of fats and carbs, and that's where they get into this trouble of, weight gain or keeping that sedentary lifestyle.
Yeah, I think also too, when people start to be more mindful and investigate, I think people take action too quickly and they just like start throwing a lot of fats in their diet, right? Because keto is big now, but it's keto is more about less carbohydrates than it is about just upping your fats because it's so important. We talked a little bit earlier. You mentioned about how like they all interact with each other, and mentioned you probably can talk about this more, but there's like a certain level of carbohydrates that can be in your system before you're going to be just completely glycogen dependent. Otherwise, you can have like I think it's up to like 40 or 50 grams of carbohydrates a day and still be burning
Yeah,
fats.
because your body's going to go through glucose neogenesis after a while, so you got to make sure the carbohydrate intake is kind of low so you don't switch out of keto. But I know a lot of people that are on keto won't touch a lot of carbohydrates, or they're cycling on the weekends. They might have some a little bit carb heavy meals, but for the most part they're strictly protein and fats just to keep on if you're strict in ketosis.
Something interesting with keto too is it takes your body a little while to adapt to being fat adaptive,
Right.
in your, as fat being your primary energy source. And so I would say that most people who are going into keto, they go into it kind of full steam, and then they really they feel like bogged down with energy. They have this term called keto flu, which is kind of like,
Right. They
essentially,
just feel
yeah, you just feel
sick.
like sick. You feel like, completely lethargic. And it's their body kind of saying like, where the hell are the carbs? I've been so reliant on these for a long time. You're not giving them to me. And now the body has to figure out essentially how to get used to fats as its main primary fuel source. And so that takes some time. And I would say, I mean, it's probably going to take a minimum of 4 weeks, probably longer, maybe even 6 to 8 weeks for your body to kind of change over into more of a fat adapted energy source state. And so, people who are just trying keto, give it some time. It does work. And, we can get into how it works for males versus females, and, intermittent fasting, same thing. It works, sometimes better for males than females because of the hormones and things like that.
Yeah.
But there's just, you got to give it a little time when it comes to the whole keto process, because most people are not fat adapted just yet.
I agree. However, I just want to specify a little bit more. Like most people who are sedentary or who might be in the routine of having a Diet Coke or a Coke once a week, or ice cream, cookies, like anything with sugar that you have constantly been putting in your body, even one thing of sugar every day for the past 6 months or more, then yeah, you're probably going to need to give it some time for your body to get fat adaptive. But
Even the people, Matt, even the people I've had clients who I'm like, oh, what do you have for breakfast? And they're like, oh yeah, I eat super healthy. I usually have a banana, and I have a no fat or low fat Greek yogurt with granola on top. And I'm like, oh great, so you eat sugar in the morning,
right,
and
right.
they
No,
think
I
that's
hear you.
healthy.
But that's a person who is continually putting sugar in their system. And if you are somebody who has been an active gym goer, you've regularly watched your diet, you would actually be surprised at if you just did keto on the weekends versus during the week, you would actually get a lot of benefits without having to necessarily do that 4 to 6 week period. Now, I'm not saying you don't try that, because it's absolutely a great experiment on your body, understand it, feel the difference when you're burning ketos versus burning glycogen. But there's a huge cognitive benefit to being on keto, but you lose that performance aspect. So for somebody who is continuously in the gym every day and they want to get these cognitive benefits that we've been talking about so much, I highly recommend sticking with your normal carbohydrate diet. Maybe you do the keto for like 2 to 3 weeks, but stick with your carbohydrate
Carbs
on
are
the
your friend.
days.
Yeah.
Exactly. On those heavy training days. And then maybe on the later training days or on the weekends, you practice keto.
Yeah, and that's if you're trying to focus still on body composition and all the things. If it's strictly performance is your goal, carbohydrates all the way. I mean, because you will be performing at a much higher intensity level.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what? It's funny is back to referencing other podcasts, whatever. We're just standing on the shoulders of giants over here. But Rob Wolf, the creator of the paleo diet, or the implementer of the paleo diet, he has a interview with Mark Sisson on the Primal Blueprint podcast, and he talks about how he loves jujitsu, and on the weeks and during the week and on the days that he trains, he's eating a lot more carbohydrates. But on the weekends when he doesn't train, or on days he doesn't train, he tries to keep his carbohydrates below 50, and he predominantly eats more fats, more vegetables. And that's kind of what it comes down to. I think a lot of people think it's the answer to their solutions when really it's more of just like a tool to add to your tool belt.
Right. And just for the listener too, like when we're saying that he's having carbohydrates, he's not eating like chips and crackers and things like that. He's eating things like, starches, like, maybe sweet potatoes and, food items like that. Right.
Speak for yourself. No, I'm just
Wow.
kidding. Yeah, absolutely. No, you're right. You're right. Like good sourcing carbohydrates, and back to macronutrients. Protein, carbs, fats. A lot of it comes down to the sourcing and quality of the nutrient itself. So it's a shame in the world we live in now, but it's like you literally are what you eats, and you're gonna have way less benefits and even maybe some harm from eating, let's say, chicken that's fed corn versus
Grass.
whatever they should be being fed. I'm not even sure what it is.
So grass. Eric, where does fiber play and mix into all this? That's something we haven't talked about yet.
Oh, that's a great one. And people don't get enough fiber, and they mistake carbs. A lot of people think carbs are bad, and they throw all that stuff right out the window. But what most people forget is a lot of carbs are actually fiber, and people need dietary fiber. Now, recommendations for men is 38 grams a day. For women, it's 25. Most people fall short of that for dietary fiber. Now, most people get carbs from refined foods, refined carbs, the simple. It's got to be more important to get carbs from or fiber from vegetables and fruits that will actually help the digestive system. Great source of carbohydrate for energy, but also it will, help cholesterol and control fat.
Yeah. And something too that Matt and I were actually talking about before we started recording here was, essentially when you're having things like sugar and stuff into your food products, if you have fiber in it, it's actually going to slow down that spike of insulin that may come, from ingesting that sugar. So eating something like condiments are a great example. A lot of condiments, like ketchup, for example, it has I think 1 tablespoon of ketchup is only 20 calories, but it's 4 grams of sugar with zero fiber in it.
High
Right?
fructose corn syrup. It's like
Right.
one of
So,
the worst.
right. And they get you on the label where it says no high fructose corn syrup sometimes, but it's still every tablespoon of ketchup you're putting on has a full teaspoon of sugar in it. So it's 1/3 of sugar essentially in that item. And there's no fiber in it, which means that is going straight into your bloodstream. That is not slowing down, and you're going to get a huge spike of insulin and then a major crash afterwards.
Oh man, there's so many different ways to branch off of what you just said. But I guess I don't have any good fiber examples because honestly, like I've avoided them. With UC, you don't really need to worry about that part, I guess. But what are some of the better fiber sources.
So for soluble fiber, you know, you have bananas, barley, beans, legumes, and I know we kind of touched about that. You know, oatmeal, peas, sweet potatoes, and then for your on your other side, you have your non-soluble beets, some cabbage, cauliflower, fruits and vegetables with skin on it.
And you need a combination of both, right?
Yes, each have different functions in the body or different GI functions, digestive
Okay.
assistance, like Mike said, blood sugar control, mental function can even be added with that.
I
Yeah.
think it's also fascinating about how white rice, when you cook white rice and you let it cool, it
Oh,
becomes
you
a
stole it from me. I was
I
actually
could
going to
sense it
say
in the
we
air.
need
I
to
had to
talk,
just
we
jump
need
on
to
it.
talk about resistant starches, and here you go. Go ahead, man.
Yeah. No, I like white rice just kind of fascinates me because it becomes a resistant starch once it's cooled. Like on the molecular level, if you eat hot, fresh cooked white rice, it's gonna act like a simple carbohydrate. But if you let it cool first to room temperature, it's gonna act like a resistant starch and be more like a fiber. And it's just fascinating how like that little of a difference makes that big of a change in your body.
Yeah, so like my Polish heritage, and we love like cold potato salad. Now I don't feel bad eating it. I mean, the mayo is one thing and all that, and that, but cold potato salad, I guess, isn't that bad for you after all.
Cold potato salad
Yeah.
sounds nasty.
Oh, come on, man.
What'd you
You've
eat
never
for
had cold
like
potato
St.
salad?
Patty's
It's
Day? Is there like a
delicious.
typical Polish St. Patty's Day meal?
You got to be kidding me.
Uh,
There's bacon in it. I mean, wow. And why are you talking about an Irish holiday and Polish food? That makes no sense.
no, because there really is. It's like oh man, I had it because
Bangers and mash,
um
bro. Bangers and mash.
that's Irish. No, there was oh man. Oh don't worry guys. Hang
Pierogies.
tight. I'll make sure I get that information for the next podcast. No, I really wish I could think of it right now, but it looks like I don't have enough lion's mane in my diet to.
No, but the resistant starch is interesting because even when so like say you heat something and then cool it, and then you heat it and cool it again, it
It
becomes
gets
even more and
more.
more resistant. Yeah, yeah. So it doesn't matter how many times you heat it up and cool it, it's going to get more and more resistant.
So leftover rice is better than fresh rice.
Who'd have thunk it?
Yeah, right. Well, let's get into some micronutrient stuff before we run out of time here.
So what I found is a big thing, especially with protein and young athletes and vegetarians. It says that with a lot of where they're not getting enough protein, they're actually missing out on micronutrients as well. And on the flip side, if you have a very high protein intake, your body actually excretes calcium. So it can be actually a detrimental effect with those with low vitamin D levels and iron levels. So with the macronutrients, micronutrients play a huge role with that. And a lot of times people aren't getting enough micronutrients in their diet.
And partly because a lot of the people who are getting even the macronutrients are getting it in a supplement form, and they're missing out on a lot of, again, like kind of the micronutrients in the product, and they're missing out on the bioavailability of it. Because say for example you ate spinach and you ate salmon and you ate equal parts, you would be able to absorb way more iron from the salmon than you would from the spinach. So I'm sorry, anybody who's vegan out there who's listening to this podcast, but you really should consider throwing a little bit of protein in your diet. It'll go a long way.
Yeah, and I know you're big into the iron, the heme and non-heme iron of the availability of absorption rate for meat and plant. And I think that's a big issue that people need to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Also, it was corned beef and cabbage, by the way, Mike. It just kind of came right to me. That's how my brain works. It's like dial-up internet.
Yeah, I hear you.
Um,
Well, one of the other ones,
micronutrients,
yeah, one of the
right?
micronutrients that I think is one of the most common deficiencies is magnesium too. Magnesium, pretty important for your nervous system function as well. So for people who are, obviously into a lot of exercise, um, really, really a great way to kind of supplement and increase your nervous system function. Um, I can also say I have some anecdotal kind of evidence that magnesium also works for restless leg syndrome, which is a neurological issue. Um, and there's a couple supplements. I actually take one once in a while, not too often, but it's a magnesium supplement called Natural Calm. And we all know magnesium as that supplement like milk of magnesia or Mylanta, which is a essential something to help you go to the bathroom, right? So you don't want to take it in that large
Yeah.
quantity, but when taken in a smaller dosage, it can really help with excitability. So people who kind of, do you ever get that kind of tired and wired feeling at the end of the day, where like your body is exhausted, but you have that kind of wired kind of feeling where your mind's really going, or you have this excitability? Magnesium, yeah,
Every
magnesium
night.
can really help. And if you're deficient in that, you're going to kind of feel like that. So if you can add some magnesium into your diet, now it's in vegetables and things like spinach and stuff like that. But adding in a supplementation of it in the form of like Natural Calm, which comes in like a gummy form, or you can get it in just a powder form that you mix in hot water, can actually really help relax your nervous system and kind of prepare you for essentially, sleep.
Yeah, it's funny is I used I tried magnesium oil for a little bit. I was having some bad uh,
Tingly,
tennis elbow, and I just kept
it's tingly, right?
yeah, and it actually I don't know, maybe it's just in my head, but I felt like it was working, and further research shows that it's been able to help people with pain from like fibromyalgia and stuff like that. So it is pretty fascinating because I'm sure it's getting absorbed transdermally into your
Yeah,
bloodstream.
yeah, absolutely.
So magnesium, and what
Uh,
was the
so
best supplement you
so
said? You
I
said
use
the
Natural
gummies.
Calm. I have both forms. I have they're kind of like, I wouldn't recommend them. They're sugar coated gummies. I don't really use them all that much. But there is also a powder form. It's a micronized magnesium, so it mixes very like it's very fine, and it mixes extremely. There's no sediment whatsoever. So you just basically brew like a 6 to 8 ounce cup of hot water, and then mix in maybe like 2 teaspoons of this Natural Calm. You can get it at Whole Foods or any kind of health food store. And yeah, you take it like 30 minutes to 45 minutes before bed, and it will definitely kind of relax your whole nervous system and kind of calm your system down.
Nice. The other one I'm kind of interested in and knowing good supplement sourcing is vitamin D, because that seems to be the number one most deficient vitamin in the population, because we don't get enough sun. But essentially, it is so popular that in maybe the last 3 to 5 years or so, um, they no longer cover a vitamin D deficiency test by insurance, because they're just assuming, listen, the odds are is that you're deficient. So, I know it's super important for the absorption of some of these other trace elements like calcium, magnesium, stuff like that. Do you guys have a recommendation at all about where to look for a good vitamin D supplement, and maybe how much to take and stuff like that?
I got one. Walk outside when it's sunny.
Yeah, yeah, he's true. He's right.
No, I know, it's true. But a lot of
Well,
people
for
work nine
food
to
sources,
fives.
I
I
would
respect
say if
that.
you're gonna look for it in a food source, fatty fish, salmon, sardines, things like that. Egg yolks
Yeah.
have it; they have a decent amount. I would say salmon probably has a much higher. I think cod liver probably has the highest amount in regards to a food source. But yeah, sunshine. I mean, and you could see that when you look at the studies, when they look at like people who live further from the equator actually have much more deficiency, especially in elderly people. Dark skin individuals actually have lower levels of vitamin D. It's pretty interesting. It's very relative to sun exposure.
And the thing with especially vitamin D, it affects calcium and phosphorus absorption and help the skin. And it also, many people forget, it is an
Yeah.
anti-inflammatory. So it does have a good effect for the body. It actually has multiple effects for bones, contractions, everything else. And I think a lot of people really forget about micronutrients, vitamin and minerals as a whole. And they just think, okay, if I just get macronutrients, I should be good. But they start missing these anti-inflammatory nutrients that can really benefit them, the vitamins, stuff that they're not getting through foods they should be eating.
Yeah, I think of like construction workers who are out in the sun,
Oh yeah.
plus like, putting a lot of stress on their musculoskeletal system. They must have a high level of vitamin D in their system, right?
Yeah, for sure. They're outside all day. It's I don't know. It's hard to tell somebody to go sit out in the sun when everyone's afraid of skin cancer. So, but I think
Right.
what
What do they say? 15 minutes?
15 minutes of no sunscreen of just raw exposure to the sun has
Mm.
more benefits than costs.
But I think a lot of times with vitamin deficiency is people look towards, like GNC Vitamin Shop. They kind of panic and go, I have to get a pill form of this. And I always tell people like, hold on a sec, go look up online or in a book of food sources, like Mike said earlier, for like the fatty fish, because a lot of stuff that you can kind of get protein, healthy fats also are going to have very nutrient dense micronutrients. I think a lot of people don't associate that with, and they think they need to take a multivitamin or take 25 different pills of this vitamin, this mineral, which some people at the end of the day might need. But if most people get on a structured diet of healthy protein, healthy fats, and vegetables and fruits, they're going to get most of these vitamins and minerals by eating that, rather than just eating processed grains, cereals, low fat, no fat yogurt. I mean, you're not going to get the same nutrients.
Yeah, and a lot of these vitamins and minerals too
Yeah,
are fat
absolutely.
soluble, and you may not even be, absorbing any of them if you're not having sufficient fats in your diet as well. So that's why fish, extremely important to have in your diet. Um, but in that regard, like talking about fat, I think it's interesting too that, and I don't know if you guys heard this, but over the last couple of years, I want to say it was like 2016, where the
Yes.
USDA basically lifted, or was the U.S. government maybe said that fat is no longer kind of like the enemy where it was on the old food pyramid, and you can essentially eat as much fat as you
Correct.
want in your diet without kind of the detriment or the ill effects of what they had thought previously. So the research is really coming through now, and I think he's the chairman of the is the Institute of Functional Medicine. Dr. Mark Hyman out of the Cleveland Clinic wrote a book called "Eat Fat, Get Thin," which I think is pretty fascinating and talks a lot about kind of the not totally keto, but a high fat diet and its health benefits in reducing the growth of cancer cells and obviously cognitive function and what we previously thought that eggs were the big like egg yolks were the big victim and everyone went to eating egg whites, right? Because egg yolks had all this cholesterol. But what we realize is, yeah,
Like there's
right. But
so
what we
much more
realize is
benefit
like
from the
there
yolk.
80% of the vitamins and minerals in an egg come from the yolk. So the cholesterol fighting effects of those vitamins and minerals in the yolk that we're removing actually offset the what you may be trying to do by avoiding the cholesterol in the first place by just eating the egg whites. So really some fascinating stuff there.
Yeah, you brought up a good point about the USDA because they are sponsored by Coca Cola. So, they did lift the ban or the negative stigma on fats, but it's been a long time coming and it needed to happen. But they will never argue that sugars are bad. And, sugar addiction definitely starts at a young age. And I know we talked about this on the last podcast, but cereals, man, 50% of them, or most of them are just 50% sugar anyway. It hijacks your dopamine system. So right off the bat, you're going to want them more. You're going to crave them more. You're going to enjoy them more. You're going to yearn for them more. And you're already starting off at a young age to get that into your system. And you almost rely heavily on a sugar based or carbohydrate based diet, just sort of strictly out of being kind of like an animal essentially. But one of the crazy things is the way that sugar plays a role and causes a lot of inflammation, especially in the brain. But if I had to pick public enemy number one, it'd be sugar for sure.
Right. And I think a lot of people, and I think you're totally on point, but I think a lot of people hear sugar, they think carbs automatically. And I think that's where a lot of this gets kind of skewed, is because a lot of people will say, well, I'm not going to eat any kind of carb because it's a sugar. Well, at the end of the day, you're right. We need glucose for cell function and energy, which everything will be eventually turned into a glucose molecule. But it's more the simple sugars that people need to avoid. The complex carbohydrate with the fibers and resistant starches are the go-to for your carbohydrate needs and for vitamins, because there's just some vitamins that you can get from carbohydrates source that you're not going to get through fats and proteins.
Yeah, and it's also important to remember that carbohydrates, technically, fruits and vegetables are carbohydrates, or contain carbohydrates in some degree. But back to the sugar thing, what you were saying about the fruits and stuff is, a good sort of general rule of thumb is berries typically have less sugar content. They're higher in amino acids and higher in those phytonutrients that help ward off disease. So I stick to I recommend blackberries, blueberries, raspberries, and then specifically for me, because I have ulcerative colitis and anyone who has other sort of GI issues, when I buy bananas, I buy them green and I peel them to keep a really low sugar content and to keep more prebiotics in the banana. And I just kind of cut them up and meal prep my breakfast
I think
for the
bananas
week.
and I want to say grapes are two of the highest fruits that have the highest content of sugar. Pomegranates, I think, are up there as well. I think there's a ton of sugar in pomegranates.
Interesting. Yeah, I knew that pomegranates did, but I didn't know bananas were
to your
considered
point, what
one of
you
the
just
higher
said,
sugar
that was,
ones.
I'm glad you said you eat them. Like green bananas are actually a resistant starch. Did you ever notice like a really banana that's like brown, and then when you open it up, you eat it, it's extremely sugary compared to
And you get
yeah,
a little drunk.
and two, bananas are glucose versus an apple, for example, which is more fructose, right? So glucose, you're essentially
Fructose.
just like dumping a teaspoon
Yeah.
of sugar right into your system by chomping into a over ripened banana. So
And real quick, what's the difference between fructose and
glucose we know
glucose?
as it's and maybe Menchie can speak a little bit more about this from a scientific level. I don't, I'm not qualified, but I would say like glucose. We know
I think we're all qualified, but yeah,
well,
I would have
glucose
referred
is
to
kind of
mention
like
this one
sugar
too.
in its simplest, like readiest form to be used. Whereas fructose, I think, has the fiber content. It has to go through more of a process to become glucose. Whereas glucose it's ready to go. It's like that on deck batter that's ready to like step up to the plate. Whereas fructose is kind of like the guy in the hole, if you know what I mean.
Mike kind of hit it right there. Is glucose is the simplest form you can get for energy, and that's what your body's going to use. Everything is going to be made or broken down into glucose, and fructose is just a bigger molecule that needs a little more time to be broken down into that glucose. A couple more hydrogen and oxygen chains on that. So at the end of the day, fructose is going to take a little bit longer through the metabolic process to break down into glucose. And if you take a banana in and it's straight glucose, you're getting ATP and energy right off the bat there. Which I gotta say, if you're an athlete or you're someone who, like Mike said, high performance, a banana that's ripened is not a bad thing if that's your demand or your sport. And I think a lot of people get afraid of that and they say, "Oh, bananas are bad." For some people, they're not the greatest thing, but for other people who need that and that energy
Yeah,
turnover, absolutely go for it.
right.
Yes, if you have a body comp goal, banana is probably not the solution for you before you go work out at the gym to try to get your energy. But if you have a performance goal where, your goal is to do lift more weight or do more rounds or run a specific time, by all means, have the banana. It augments your your performance by getting more
You want to take?
glucose in your
Yeah.
system pre-workout because you are going to work at a high intensity level enough to use it.
I love it. This is a great episode. I want to hear people's closing statements. Unless you guys want me to go first,
Go
I
for it,
totally
Matt.
understand. All right. So my closing statement, my takeaway, my implementation, if you've been listening to the whole podcast so far, is balance. Balance, balance, balance. Not one thing is going to be bad. Not one thing is going to be that be all end all fix to get you where you're going to want to go. And not one thing is going to be the best thing for you to just keep consuming. So it's about trying something and making adjustments as you go. That's it. Yeah,
Yeah,
so that's my
I
takeaway.
would echo that, and I would just add to it that you need to listen to the feedback that your body's giving you. So we don't take enough time to kind of slow down, and when we do eat something, actually pay attention to what it's doing to our system. We There are a lot of times when you eat something
Right.
and we just kind of slug through our day, not realizing that we're at a more of a cognitive kind of
Decline, or we're bloated, or we're having inflammation. Absolutely. Yeah.
decline for that day. Exactly. Right. Right. Versus eating a food and then an hour later saying, "Wow, like I feel like so clear. My mind is thinking like, so clearly. I have so much more energy right now." Pay attention to that feedback. Your body's always giving you feedback. I love a lot of people say food is energy, but food is not energy. Food is information. It's information. It is
Medicine.
medicine. It could
Oh,
be medicine,
okay.
but it's definitely information. Food turns off certain gene sequences, and it's really important to pay attention to that feedback that the what it's giving you. And if we could be more mindful when we are taking in these different types of macronutrients throughout the course of the day, we will then take note of those things and then know how we should proceed from here on out and stop mindlessly going through life eating garbage that's really not giving us any type of benefit for what our actual goals and values are lined up to be.
I think you nailed it right there when you said mindful, and that's kind of the root. I tell people, or we can sit up here all day and talk about protein, carbs, fats, what's good, what's bad, but at the end of the day, it comes to that individual's decision of being mindful of what they're going to put in their body. And most people know what's good for their body and what's bad, but making that right decision, progressing yourself towards your goals, towards your behavior, towards even feeling better. Pick the right things to put on your plate at the end of the day or at the beginning of the day.
Well, that kind of wraps up this week's episode. Like I said,
We'll
next
let you
week we're
finish.
going to dive into the deadlift. And if you wanted to send in a question, please don't hesitate. thinkfitnesslife@gmail.com. Again, that's thinkfitnesslife, all one word, @gmail.com. This has been wonderful.